Hi everyone, and welcome to this video podcast for Security Magazine, sponsored by Cyjax. Well folks, we have a really full video podcast because we're going to talk about space.
The final frontier.
The final frontier.
God.
We're going to talk about the geopolitical aspects. We're going to talk about the scientific aspects about it. But I think, to set the stage, the one takeaway I have is when I was growing up, we thought that our solar system was like kind of the beginning and the end.
Yeah.
And now, at the ripe old ages that we all are, except for Lisa, we are in a position where we have discovered worlds outside our solar system on other stars. And it's mind-boggling that in the stretch of the last 70 and 80 years since we've had space travel, and it's now become a part of our everyday lives, even if we don't know that it's actually part of our everyday life. I'm going to get Lisa set the stage for us, because you walked us through how there's sort of three different groups of like space, the industry.
Yeah, I mean, you had a great stat. I can't remember what the figure was, but from World Economic Forum.
1.8 trillion in potential gross national product added to the sort of ability of our planet to generate commerce.
Yeah, and I think they also said that it was an industry that was growing by around 9% per annum, which is enormous.
Faster than GDP.
Yeah, which is enormous if it's true. The workings weren't actually.
Yeah, how we calculate.
Brought up by the space industry, of course, analysing themselves and saying this is what's going to happen. Invest in us, please.
Yeah, exactly. But I think the interesting thing about space at the moment, sort of to set the sort of global scene, if you look at like the traditional space powers, which were like the United States, Russia, China, obviously, Japan to some degree as well, that's sort of shifted. And one of the things that I've seen that's quite interesting, for example, Saudi Arabia getting very heavily involved in this, along with pretty much everything else in the entire world at the moment. But also Peru and Thailand are also getting heavily involved in the space industry, and they're seeing this as a way of connecting their rural communities and their schools that would otherwise not have access to the internet, to be able to do so through sort of satellite communications. So actually it is spreading across the world in terms of like its penetration, I suppose. And there's sort of three segments, I think, and all of which I'm sure we'll touch upon both from a geopolitical standpoint and a cybersat standpoint. So in the space industry, you've got the sort of user segment, which would be planes, ships, your mobile phones, things like that might communicate with, say, a satellite. Then you've got the space segment, which is the actual satellite in orbit or whatever device is up there. And then you've got the ground segment, which is sort of ground stations that are used to relay satellite communications and so on and so forth. And typically the ground segment has been the most vulnerable and easy to target segment of all of those, because I think a lot of them are unmanned, they're in really rural areas, like security-wise, not been great. But those are the sort of three main sectors that I think we need to have a look at.
Let's talk a little bit, Phil, from your perspective. Obviously, everybody gets nervous when a protagonist nation state manages to put something up in orbit or gets really close to putting something up in orbit, but what goes inevitably up from said country may come down. Mm-hmm. There's geopolitical implications of these nations sort of doing rogue things where we have these international agencies for cooperation. NASA, we can put into that category, although it's heavily sort of American influence because that's where most of their money is coming from. But when you look at the European Space Commission and other sort of aligned, shall we say, Canada's part of every group that's out there. It's like, we want to be part of the party, please invite us. The question I have for you is, how do we govern, basically that whole issue? Does every nation have a right to space?
Well, it's a really difficult question to answer, because if we look at it from not just a geopolitical and a threat perspective, but look at the practical implications of anyone who can put a missile or a rocket with a payload on it into space, they've effectively got ballistic missile technology.
Right.
Now, this isn't just now limited to countries, but we're getting commercial entities who've got that ability. So, Elon Musk can put
things into orbit.
whatever payload that he wants into orbit.
Like a Tesla.
Like a Tesla, and send it to Mars, possibly more successfully than some of the other things that have headed to Mars. Richard Branson, with his Virgin Space program, has got the ability to put stuff into space. There are going to be more commercial entities, and some of the countries that you mentioned, Lisa, we forget that the UAE have put satellites into space. There's alongside what everyone looks at as a nuclear arms race, there's a ballistic missile arms race going on between different countries. And the ballistic missile arms race is significantly ahead of where some of the known nuclear technologies are, but it's not just nuclear weapons, it's the ability to do damage to that $1.8 trillion worth of potential that's in space by either deliberately targeting things that are up there, or more likely accidentally interfering with what's going on and creating a sort of domino effect of catastrophe going through space. And I don't think the levels of regulation are really there at the moment, because we're seeing that with the controversy that's surrounding Elon Musk putting his Starlink capability into space purely for commercial reasons, but he's putting payloads up there, and those payloads are impacting communications, and they're not just civilian communications, because we see it being used heavily by the Ukrainians and
the Russians, apparently, even though that they're under sanction.
Well, exactly, but we're also
surely not. Elon must be. He's a straight up guy. There's no way.
We're also then seeing Elon Musk and his commercial team turning on and turning off the capabilities that they put into space, and that isn't going through any nation state or got any international body oversight in what's going on, and they're making these commercial decisions. So I think from a threat risk perspective, and look at that from a potential impact perspective, space is the Wild West at the moment. And unless we get something in very quick indeed, and the 1969 or 68 or 67 Outer Space Treaty is not fit for purpose, in the same way that in the UK the 1990 Computer Misuse Act is not fit for purpose. It's time for international organizations to get together and come up with some proper regulation over and above what's in place at the moment, to try and make sure that when you put a satellite in one particular bit of space, that someone else isn't going to try and put another satellite in exactly the same place. That level of coordination, everything's going on at the moment, but it's understanding the what's going up, who's controlling it, why is it going up, where is it being authorized. This isn't happening on an international basis, so it is a space race. And I think we're starting to get to the point where we're going to have to clear up some of the mess, and certainly the generations ahead of us, the mess that we're leaving for them up there is phenomenal.
That's actually probably one of our best segues ever, because we're going to talk about the cyber mess that is in space. Specifically, we're going to talk about it because there is a whole bunch of legacy tech floating around out there. Some of it is still critical and in use today, but others are defunct and kind of just represent something heavy that you could accidentally hit that's flying around at an ungodly speed around the planet. Is the cyber threat to space a real thing? Are people really concerned that satellites could be moved or communications could be disrupted via a cyber attack?
I think there's a really big difference between what would be possible and what would actually happen. And I think one thing that we've seen, and Phil and I were talking about it before we started filming, was like the ship that hit the bridge in the United States.
Right.
And instantly that sort of descended into this bizarre narrative about how someone has hijacked the controls on the ship and all done this through a cyber capability because some film said it was possible.
Yeah.
And then crashed it into the bridge, and that's it. And we were talking about, okay, yeah, you've got the capability to do that. We definitely would have the capability to do that. We know that jamming, we know that interception of data, hijacking of guidance systems, technically possible, right? There'll be people out there who would have those capabilities, probably. The opportunity is there because the attack surface is there, right? Same for the ship. But what's the motivation of the actor to do that? And I think that's where you've got to start questioning things. And like Phil said, we've got a load of different countries who have lots of different legacy tech up there. It's not just the Americans who've got legacy tech, the Russians have got stuff, the Chinese have got stuff. So again, it's a bit like that nuclear arms race. It's like, okay, at state level, why are we doing that?
Right.
What's the motivation, and are you starting something that you don't want to be starting? And then at sort of cyber attacker level, again, I think the problem you have in the cyber community is often the narrative suddenly swings to people crashing satellites into the Earth and killing loads of people.
Right.
The reality of that, I would say, is probably pretty low. I think the higher chance of something happening is interception of data.
Yeah.
That's probably where the bigger problem is. And that can be done at the point that the satellite's designed and assembled, so interfering with the hardware that's produced in a specific country whose name we won't mention, and it's put into the satellite and can be used to intercept data.
The infamous backdoor.
The backdoor.
The backdoor.
But also sort of getting into ground stations and interfering with the data as it comes into there, or interfering with the data as it passes through your endpoints, your plane or your ship or your mobile phone. And I think that then is less sexy, but it's probably a more realistic, immediate threat to a lot of this stuff.
Again, when we talk cyber attacks, people automatically think that you're going in to try and take control of something and move it to do something different. When in reality, as we see in the normal cyber environment, the theft of data, stealing data, putting something in there that's continuously listening to what's going on with all the communications that's going through is much more valuable to you. We've seen recently the GPS spoofing that's going on around Ukraine and elsewhere, and that is having a physical effect, and that is you using a control mechanism over something in space at some stage electronically or through the cyber environment to spoof the GPS, and that's having a military effect. That's causing nations then to go, we need to get something that can't be spoofed, and we put our own stuff up and is enhancing the space race that's going on.
And I think, sorry, one last thing, like DDoSing. Like cutting out communication so you can't use GPS. That would be pretty useful. Right?
And,
so again,
can be done. The technology exists today. It's very easy.
It always just comes back to that CIA stuff. Confidentiality, integrity, availability. And it's not sexy, because it's not crashing a satellite into the space station and then crashing the space station into the Earth.
Right.
But that's probably what we're
And it's all down to effect. Capability and effect. You've got a capability to do anything that you want, but where are those that want to and have the technology to interfere? What's the effect that they want to get? And most of that effect is I class them as soft effects. They're not trying to do something hard. It's something soft. And keep that vulnerability hidden and open, and their ears open and listening and hoovering everything in.
I'm reminded of sort of like our approach to space right now reminds me of the Cold War era of submarines trailing submarines. Because what happens underwater is really difficult to figure out exactly what's going on. Space has some of those capacities as well, where for every American communications satellite, there may be some other nations that we're not going to name right nearby to try
Russia and China.
Those guys.
Yeah, we're not naming them.
But the other problem is, of course, that 1.8 trillion, let's come back to that for a moment, because that's the supply chain of space, right? Which means that the opportunities for tampering, for interfering with that integrity, making availability sporadic, all of those capabilities would exist in the supply chain partners and the vulnerabilities that they might have. Do you think that, are there any sort of, you had mentioned the ISO standard for the life cycle of a satellite. Walk us through that.
Decommissioning of it. And I think the point about supply chains is really interesting. The space industry has a massive problem with that, because they have an absolutely enormous supply chain. I would argue probably these companies have supply chains bigger than any other industry that we know. They're enormous. Like, you have an entire company that just makes one bolt, for example. So the supply chain is enormous. And if you think about that in terms of our sort of traditional industries here on Earth, we don't have good supply chain management right here, right now.
No, it's abysmal.
It's abysmal. So now amplify that across a supply chain that is an absolute monster, and see where the problems are going to start coming out. And I think you're right that the issue that you have So there's this NIST report that came out on sort of the regulation of space. And they broke down the cybersecurity problem into lots of different really good stages. And one of them was, the initial design of, let's just use satellites as an example, the initial design and development of the satellite, which is one thing. Then the assembly, which is a whole other thing, which is when you bring in the issues with hardware and potential interference with hardware and
You could have
firmware.
completely vacuum sealed, no dust, no nothing.
Where is it produced?
Yeah.
Who's in the factory that's producing it? You have all of those supply chain issues. Then you have the pre-launch issue. So this is when the satellite is assembled and moved to a launch site. So you've got physical security concerns in how that is locked up, secured, moved to the launch site, protected. Can anyone interfere with it at that point? The launch, which as we discussed, in the initial stages, they have like a 30% loss, which is big. And then they claim that will drop to 5% after 10 launches or something, which also still feels massive. But anyway, whatever.
Part of that 1.8 trillion then might be the insurance policy costs.
Yeah.
Well, it will be then. There is insurance, but whenever you fail once or twice, I think you can't find insurance. Like you can't find car insurance.
Then the next stage is when it's actually in orbit. And the risk here is, so when you launch a satellite, let's say you're launching a satellite for Grey Hare Media,
Okay.
And you launch the satellite and you're the person who's done that, there's a point where when the satellite's now in orbit, you have to hand over custody of that satellite to Phil, which is another cybersecurity concern. This is
Sure.
another potential for malicious actors to get involved when you hand over that command and control of that satellite to Phil to now run, right? So that's another concern. And then the final one, which brings in what you were just saying, is the decommissioning. So there's an ISO standard about the decommissioning of satellites, but there's an obvious cybersecurity concern there as well in terms of how we do that and how we do that securely and making sure that the data is still available.
I thought all we do is just crash it into the ocean. Wasn't that the traditional way?
It's the ultimate DDoS.
blah, 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 blah. Yeah, but and again, we go back to this tech thing, is like now we're a lot more, during the heyday of the 1960s and 70s of the American and Russian and Chinese space programs, there wasn't an environmental concern about this extraordinary, so we've put stuff up there that is probably not healthy if it comes back down.
Yeah.
And I guess, from the perspective, Phil, my satellite, so country A's satellite, crashes into country B's satellite, and then a debris field is created, and then stuff starts raining down on country C. Like, how does that all work? Is it people getting angry at the UN and yelling at each other, or is there any sort of governance mechanism where we call the 1-800 my satellite's out of control number?
Well, we've seen that debate happen whenever you get these warnings go out about the potential crashing of rogue Russian or Chinese satellites, of which there've been a few, or North Korea's put stuff up that doesn't quite get there and comes down quite quickly. And it's a factor that has to be looked at by those that are planning the launches and everything else. But I think the ultimate responsibility for anything that could happen for something coming down goes back to the nation state or the company that owned it in the first place. And that's where, you're the international legal expert, from an international legal perspective, that's where liability would probably lie. But I don't think it's been tested. And you're 100% right that there's some really nasty stuff up there. There are some satellites that are being powered by nuclear reactors, and we wouldn't necessarily want a nuclear reactor to start burning up in their outer atmosphere on the way down. Now, they're designed that they wouldn't do. They come down solid. But again, you don't want a nuclear reactor plunking into the sea where it could degrade in 1,000 years' time and cause an environmental disaster, or it could land in a city and there'd be an accident there where you're getting radiological damage that's being done.
Or a rather large hole if it happens to be heavy enough, right?
Well, yes, the chances of these things exploding are they're not nuclear bombs. It's very difficult to make nuclear material explode.
Yeah.
And then you've got
I've been trying.
it's things you do in your garden shed. Yeah. But and this is where the nuclear arms race. Whenever stuff is deliberately put into space, intercontinental ballistic missiles go through space, and those are proper nuclear warheads that are going through. And it's because they do that, countries will have countermeasures in various guises potentially in space, potentially ready to go into space, or ones that we know about are land or sea based, ready to be employed if necessary.
I want to explore that because remember back at the end of the Cold War, America did what was almost like a psyop against the Soviets at the time. They convinced them that they had this Star Wars program with this advanced anti-ballistic missile capability that could shoot down. Well, it turns out that trying to shoot something down in space is really tough. There's a lot of maths involved. And that because it's happening so quickly, we had issues with in terms of the amount of processing power that we would need to calculate ballistic trajectories. And in fact, some of the earliest World War I documents that I've seen that were highly classified were the ballistic calculation machines that they did for the artillery, because that which goes up, you need it to come down in a specific spot. In space, because there's a lot of garbage up there's a lot of things that could, bend, and it's not like a static environment, it's an incredibly dynamic environment. Walk us through a little bit about how difficult anti-ballistic missile capability is against ballistic missiles and new hypersonic platforms.
Well, it's massively difficult. Depends on how you describe anti-ballistic missile systems. If we look at what happens, missile will launch. It'll put a payload into space, which are the warheads. Will separate from the missile, and they will then come down independently. Re-enter the Earth's atmosphere. So you've got the launch phase. Well, you need to know where someone's missiles are and when they're going to launch them, and have your anti-missile missiles in place ready to intercept those. And they're usually over a sovereign country or somewhere hidden in the sea and all the rest of that.
Can I ask a quick question on that? So the point at which you control where these missiles come down, is that determined by the angle and trajectory of the launch, or are each individual thing
each individual thing is
in real time?
They're not controlled in real time; it's pre-programmed.
Okay.
So there isn't a live control mechanism that you can interfere with, which is it would be good if it's there. It's all pre-designed, preset, and therefore the independent warheads will come down to where you programmed to go all by themselves. And there's no interference in that. So it's very difficult to hit in the launch phase. There are space-based platforms primarily that are out there to detect launches. That then gets people really, really worried, and they're doing their calculations. And in headquarters all over the place in different countries, they're suddenly going, that launch has happened. What is it that's been launched? Where is it likely to be pointed at? What's the payload it's likely to be carrying? Is it a nuclear payload? And that's why the President of the United States goes around with a football, because he's got the decision to make in about 15 minutes. Is about the maximum that he'll have, an understanding as to whether a launch is something that's nuclear, and he then has to respond to it because it could be a first strike. This is where the Star Wars program came in, because what it did was it upset the apple cart of the mutually assured destruction by suggesting that the United States could shoot Russian missiles down during their launch phase, or just as they were deploying their multi-warheads in space before those warheads came down. And it couldn't. It was beyond, you're 100% right, it was beyond the technology at the time. But that information campaign went out, really got the Russians worried, and almost caused a nuclear war, because the Russians were then going, right, if they're bringing this technology in, we need to attack the United States before they bring the technology in. Otherwise, they're just going to attack us and use this advantage. So 1983, there's some fantastic books around. Oleg Gordievsky, who was a Russian agent run by the British, stopped the closest we've ever come to a nuclear war, which was 1983, not the Cuban Missile Crisis. Go and read the books on it. But you then got the warheads in space. Again, difficult because you're not under international treaty allowed weapons in space. Difficult to shoot those down. It would cause debris fields and could have unintended consequences of what's going on. So your anti-ballistic missile systems tend to be whenever the warheads are coming back in again on a ballistic trajectory to go into their target. And this is where we've got proven systems. The Patriot missile system is intercepting ballistic missiles in Ukraine fired by the Russians, and their hypersonic missiles as well, very successfully. It's an anti-ballistic missile system. The Patriot, the Russian S-400 was supposed to be. It's not. It can't quite do that. and that's working. But that means the warhead's coming back in again. If the warhead's a nuclear warhead and it's coming back in again, it is a nuclear bomb that's coming in, and you're going to fire another missile at it to make it go bang. That nuclear debris is going to go down somewhere. Now, it's probably better and will probably disrupt there being a thermonuclear explosion, but it's still not good if you get into that game.
Yeah.
That's possible if you've got your anti-ballistic missile systems within range where they can have their bubble
Ready, yeah.
and ready to do that. There aren't the numbers of them around to be able to provide the protection that people think there might be.
Because there's like 6,000 plus warheads in stockpile.
Yes, exactly.
It's absurd.
Yeah.
So we'll get 3 of them.
And again, this is where the mutually assured destruction it's a horrific plan, actually works.
Yeah.
Because people realise that actually the other side is always going to be able to get some through, and those some are going to be enough to completely destroy our country and our way of life and most of the planet Earth.
Yeah.
Therefore, we're not going to go down this path. And again, that's why I think we're hearing all the saber rattling from Putin about nuclear in Ukraine. If the West oversteps this red line, we're going to go nuclear. Well, I think we're about 7 or 8 red lines we've overstepped so far, and he won't, because mutually assured destruction is stopping that from happening.
Oh yeah,
and we'll continue to do so. But it's worrying as more and more countries and more commercial entities get this ballistic missile capability, and then what you can put on the end of that. It's not difficult.
But I think also that the dynamic between sort of Europe, the United States and Russia with this mutually assured destruction principle has proven to be quite effective, as you said, right? But the wild card is when you introduce things like Iran and North Korea.
Yes.
Will it work
France.
Malta.
Yeah.
Will it work as effectively?
Yeah.
Because on some level, Putin is pragmatic, right? Not at all someone who we sympathise with, but pragmatic. And so you have that dynamic that's been proven through history to have kind of worked and be this understanding. But then you have someone in North Korea who is less pragmatic, takes a lot of his advice from basketball players, other things like this. How confident are we that we can rely on that in the same way?
Not as confident, but those that are influencing North Korea in particular, the 2 countries that influence North Korea, China and Russia. Both China and Russia understand mutually assured destruction, and therefore will have a degree of control over Kim Jong-un and what he's doing with his ballistic missiles. They're happy that he fires the missiles into the Sea of Japan as he's practicing.
Stirs everybody up.
And every now and again does his little nuclear warhead tests and puts all the stuff out, because that helps disrupt the international order in the way that Russia and China will try and exploit it. But I think they've got a level of control where they would, if they can, stop him from firing. Now, he's so rogue that he could go completely independently. And this is why I think Iran hasn't got nuclear warheads at the moment, even though it's got a developing relationship over weapons supply with Russia. And I would suspect that what Iran is trying to do is to try and set the conditions for Russian payment for Iranian conventional weapons will be nuclear warheads. Now, they won't be there at the moment, because if they were there at the moment, the Israelis would have found out, and the Israelis would have gone and
it would have been
blown Tehran up. And of course, we've got the rumours that Israel is a nuclear nation as well, and therefore, if it came to that threat that there was potentially against Israel, Israel, I think, would probably be the first country that would have less qualms about using a nuclear weapon against another major population centre like Tehran, if they thought Iran was going to have nuclear weapons.
The Israelis are playing an entirely different game in calculus. If they felt that there was an existential threat to their country from anything else, they're gonna react on biblical levels. I think is the best way of describing it.
And that's why the other nations where there's rumours of weapons around.
Pakistan, India.
Pakistan and India we know, but there's rumours that Saudi Arabia may have a capability which. The same rumours turn around and say that it was bought or donated by Pakistan, but it will be keeping that regional. Trying to keep that regional piece, and that's why Iran wants it, because it thinks that Saudi has got, and it wants to keep that mutually assured destruction feeling going and everything else. there is a nuclear arms race.
And that was also funny because in our previous video podcast on the back of your Kazakhstan adventures, the adoration of Macron, the French president, it was directly result because of the massive investment in uranium mining. Or is it Mongolia? Yeah, okay.
So wandering around Ulaanbaatar at Christmas, and I remember messaging you, and I was like, it's really weird, like there's pictures of Macron everywhere, all around the capital of Mongolia.
As he was doing his boxing, did you see his boxing pictures?
Just like idolizing him on a level that I've never seen anywhere, not even in France, nowhere. And when you Googled, didn't you? And you were like, oh, this is why. And I was like,
this massive investment into uranium mining in Mongolia. But this is all part of that supply chain that we talked about. Now, I want to talk about a couple of the advanced technologies that we've had come out. So there's something called the Deep Space Network. And the Deep Space Network is the thing and system and protocol that allows for communication over vast distances, right? We had Voyager, who's now outside the solar system at, I can't remember the term, but it's in the solar medium now. It's outside the influence of our own solar system. Having said that, we're able to move a robot around Mars. And that's fascinating to me at a level that, will soon open up the doors to explore the other planets and stuff like that. How long, flat out, how long do you think before we before we colonize a place like Mars?
A very long time.
Really?
Yeah.
Okay, you're not as optimistic.
No.
Okay, why? I'm curious.
I think the problem with Mars, as I understand it from a human colonization perspective, so obviously we can get robots there, we've had UAVs, we've had quite a lot of success. I remember actually when they landed that on Mars, and then they had to do an update, and everyone in the cyber community was so jealous because they managed to push through this update onto the UAV within like 24 hours and it was done and it worked. We were like, we can't even do that on Earth. And you've updated this thing that's on another planet. Damn it.
Yeah. 99%.
Yeah, exactly. But there's lots of problems with Mars that I just don't think are immediately solvable from a human life sustainable perspective. There's actually also international conventions, which is really interesting, on, for example, like interference between planets in terms of like biological matter. So, for example, like you can't bury somebody on Mars if they were to die on Mars. You can't, like the human waste and stuff like that can't be put on Mars. They have to be kept completely separate, and the stuff from Mars can't be brought back to Earth, which is, probably correct because sci-fi films, which I'm basing all of this off of, don't tend to look that positively. That's when the aliens get in.
Yeah, and it goes sideways. Or giant robots.
I think there's a lot of, I know Elon put forward this idea of mirrors over Mars to try and melt the ice in one of the
he was
ice
even
caps.
more nuts. Previous to that, there was a suggestion that they nuke Mars.
Yes, he was
right, to create an atmosphere.
Yeah. Because there's a lot of issues that I don't think have been at all solved. Plus, there's this issue with distance. So one of the really interesting things from a launch perspective with Mars is that the window for launching something to go to Mars is really small.
Oh, okay.
It's not even every year, because in order for you to have the distance between Earth and Mars to be sufficiently small that you could travel with any meaningful amount of time from a battery perspective and whatever else, it has to be at that point that Mars and Earth are going to basically cross paths, well not cross paths, but come past each other in a parallel situation. And that doesn't happen very often because the distance is so immense. So actually you don't even have an ability to resupply. If on a regular basis, on a yearly basis, you wouldn't have that capability, which creates a whole load of problems.
Yeah, yes.
It's like the ultimate diet cap.
Like running out of toilet paper. Okay.
No more crisps for 4 to 5 years.
But again, if you look at when we first landed on the moon, and there's been no move to colonization there, and a lot of the talk about...
We haven't even managed to get back to the moon.
Well, exactly.
Yeah.
And a lot of the
keep landing space probes onto the moon upside down.
Well, exactly, or on the side. But a lot of the a lot of the discussion, I think, about trying to get humans onto the onto another planet, and to put sustainable colonies on another planet and all the rest of it, are ambitions. They're aiming marks. And what those aiming marks allow companies to do then is to develop technologies on a path to get to there. You may never get to the ultimate place because there are practical things that you just can't get round. You know, Mars, I think one of the big ones is the level of irradiation that the human beings would have in the path of flight there means that the chances are that if you could get them back, they're not going to come back alive.
I think it's a PR thing.
You think so?
Yeah, because I think it keeps the public interested in space.
Well, that's true.
Because the vast majority of this 1.8 trillion industry is communication satellites and GPS
that's true.
and stuff like that. It's not that cool. No one really cares. I mean, people don't even really care about updates on their iPhone, let alone anything else.
But they still want to get all the TV channels.
But if you start saying we're going to have a moon base and then we're going to have people colonizing Mars, well, that triggers sci-fi movies and cool stuff.
I love moon base.
And it keeps the public's support for what is pouring quite a large quantity of government and public and private money into an industry that's blowing stuff up.
Yeah.
You know, it's always been the situation. And
at
NASA,
a rate of about 30%.
And NASA had this with the space shuttle, right?
Yeah.
The space shuttle was completely useless. It was a terrible invention. It was really expensive. It wasn't cost effective. It was just a disaster. But it kept public support.
It did.
And people loved it, and they'd turn up for the launches. And so then people could keep putting money into the space program.
And the economic benefits of that are you're finding that you will get investments into small companies and small technologies and all the rest of it that would be so horrendously expensive if you're trying to do that from a commercial perspective on Earth for something that you're looking. But you're getting inventions that are proving useful once they've been through the whole space program and brought to their ultimate end, and then can be used back in on Earth. Well, it could never be developed if there wasn't something ambitious like a space program.
I do think there's a bit of sort of nation-state muscle flexing as well. So obviously China landed on the dark side of the moon. That was like, woo, yay. Then India, I think, landed on the pole, the pole of the moon. And so there was like, I think there's a little bit of this where it's like, look what we can do, like our space program.
It started that way. Sputnik going up, the Americans suddenly went, oh my goodness, right, so how are we going to beat Sputnik?
Yeah.
Put a man on the moon. Do it. The motivation was to get one over on the Russians, because the Russians have got one over on the Americans.
And we're still in that game.
And we're still in that game.
100%. Well, you know, things change, the inevitable sort of progress of technology. This was our look at space for all of our valued viewers, and we look forward to seeing you guys on the next one.
To boldly go where no man or woman has gone before, or is it going bold?
Smashed it.
I don't know. I don't know.